We're happy to welcome Peggy Simonsen tonight as she shares 50 ways to improve habitat in your yard. Peggy created this program to celebrate Citizens for Conservation's 50th anniversary. Peggy is currently chair of Citizens for Conservation's Community Education Committee. She's on the board of directors and is former president of Citizens for Conservation. She often is participating in restoration projects as a volunteer, and she's improved habitat in her yard with over 200 species of native plants. Tonight, we're about to learn ways to use shrubs, trees, and native plants in all seasons while managing our water resources and using earth-friendly practices. The goal of these actions is to create a welcoming habitat for birds, pollinators, and other creatures, and in turn, improve water and air quality and create beautiful landscapes. I believe you'll agree that her goals fit right in with the practices and aims of Wild Ones. Let's get ready to find out how we can improve habitat in our own yards and growing spaces. Welcome, Peggy. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, that's exactly right. Citizens for Conservation was founded in the Barrington area in 1971. And so over the years, I've been working with the Community Education Committee for about 15 years now. And some of these ways that I put into this program came from a number of different projects that we've had over the years, but pulled them all together into one program. Lots of things. I'm going to talk fast, but I expect most of you are using some of these doing some of these things. Some of you maybe a little bit newer to the process, but I'm hoping that you'll either, if you don't learn something new, maybe you'll take action on something that you've known about but not used yet, or share some of them with others. Pleased to say that they are recording this program. So as I'm moving through things quickly, if you, instead of having to scribble notes real fast, you can take a look back at the recorded program and pick up on something that you might like to review again. So given that, let's see, I'm going to have to do this. Just a little bit of background. You know, over the years, in the past, we've only asked one thing of our gardens, to be pretty. But now they have to support life, sequester carbon, support pollinators, and manage water. That's a quote from Douglas Tallamy, and I think those of you that have been gardening for a long time recognize how that has evolved particularly the last few years. And also that 95% of the original habitat in the US is gone. So that means 95% of the native species will go extinct if we don't recreate some of that missing habitat. And that's really the goal of us doing it. Yes, we want to do it on public lands, but as Tallamy points out, most of the land that's available to work on is in privately owned and in fact homeowners, people's yards. So I'm sure you're working on that, as I am, to try to improve it. I'm going to see if I can. I don't know if you're seeing these on the side, but let's see if I can move. There we go. The categories I'm going to be talking about, as Kathy mentioned, are these. There's 10 of these categories, so 5 things in each category to come up to our 50. Starting with native trees. This is not a home, this is a property in Barrington that Citizens for Conservation has restored. It's called Baker's Lake, and it's just in the spring, in another month or so, the carpet is just full of wildflowers underneath the oak trees. Oak hickory woods were the predominant covered, particularly in northern Illinois, not quite so densely in your area, but still oaks covered the whole state. And they support over 500 species of life, more than any other plant. And just as a footnote, everything I'm talking about here, it says always plant trees that are native to Northern Illinois. All of what I'm talking about today are native plants. The problem is, in our area particularly, there was a study done in Lake County, which is the northernmost county from Lake Michigan, a little bit to the west, a few years ago, and they found that something like 60% of all the trees in Lake County are buckthorn. And the buckthorn, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that's really squeezing out the oak hickory woods that were natural here to start with. So here are some examples, a couple of examples of if you only do one thing, if you don't have oaks in your yard and you only do one thing as a result of this program, plant an oak tree. If you have room and sun, plant a white oak. They spread, get big, but it's interesting. I have a bunch of white oaks in my yard that were remnants. And because they grew up together, they don't spread out like this. Mine are skinny and they create their own shade, and they're not as beautiful as this, but they're still surviving. But if you're planting one from scratch, you want to put it out in the sun. And of course, here's the white oak leaves on that. A smaller oak tree is the red oak. And this one can take a little bit more shade, happier than the white oak, and is likely to be dry to medium soil. So lots of other oaks, and you have more, if you have some wetlands or swamp white oaks, there's many more oaks that are possibilities. But if you don't have an oak, plant one. I have a good friend who's a gardener. She's not so much a native plant gardener, but we've grown up and worked together over the years. And she has a beautiful yard, but she didn't have any oaks. So one Christmas I gave her an oak certificate, and I bought it for her in May, and she planted it, and she was surprised at how quickly it started to grow. Oops, here we go. Another beautiful native are the Shagbark Hickories. It's amazing how many things harbor or live or lay eggs under here, particularly the morning cloak butterfly that lives under the shagginess. This also says full sun, but I also have a grove of hickories on my property that were remnant and grew up from, 50, 70 years ago or something. And so they do okay in shade, but again, if you're planting one from scratch, try to put it in a sunnier location. Here's a whole lot of other good native trees. There's many more. I'm just trying to touch the surface on them. In addition to the shagbark hickory, there's the bitternut hickory that has a gorgeous yellow color in the fall. I'll show you pictures of these a little bit later. The hackberry is a good one. If you're buying a tulip tree, be sure you buy it by its Latin name, because there's all sorts of non-natives, things called tulip trees. But the tulipifera is the one that is the native. And again, lots of birches. Any of them are good, but I've just suggested the yellow birch is an easier one to grow. And the redbud, I like it because it's an understory tree. I have, as I mentioned, all these big trees. I didn't have a lot of understory, and so I planted some redbuds. But the neat thing about these is that they bloom so early in late April, early May, that sometimes they're the only thing blooming, and they're wonderful nectar for the birds. So there's some food for the birds to happen. Whoops, went backwards here. And also a comment about the maples. If you have a Norway maple, consider cutting it down and replacing it with a sugar maple. And if you're planting a maple from scratch, use a sugar maple. The Norway maples are not native, obviously, and they are so dense that they shade everything. Nothing can grow under them. And people say, what can I plant under my Norway maple? And I say, oh, maybe you can put some mulch down there, but get rid of the Norway maple. And they don't support any of the wildlife that our natives do. And of course, the wild black cherry is another one. Here are the trees not to plant. I mentioned the Norway maple. A Chinese elm, of course, we're not planting them anymore, but some of them are still hanging around and maybe diseased. The tree of heaven, this and the Callery pear were planted as landscape trees by a lot of villages and cities over the years, and we're finding out the tree of heaven is so aggressive and so invasive. They'll have shoots coming up all over the place under it. And again, you aren't likely to go wanting to plant one of these, but if you have one, you might consider cutting it down. when I moved into my property here, I had never cut down a live tree before, but I sure cut that tree of heaven down. It was just shooting up shoots everywhere. And this is a Bradford pear in the fall. They're very pretty and they have beautiful white flowers in the spring. But the problem with those is that they escape from the landscape and into natural areas, and they are hybridizing with the native prunus, the pears and plum trees, and driving them out, so that we're losing our native ones because of these. I helped with landscaping of my church, and there were some Callery pears that had been planted on the roadway along the street, and we just had to make the decision to cut them down because several of us are restoration volunteers, and we know the damage that they're doing to our nearby woods. And again, I expect you folks know this, but sometimes you have to educate landscapers not to put volcanoes around the base of trees. It rots the tree trunk, and it causes the roots to grow up instead of down. So all in all, a bad thing. I just cringe when I see a landscape property that somebody's done that to. Also, consider grinding up mulching your leaves and putting them under trees rather than bagging them and putting them out by the curb. Or as I do, I have a compost pile. I grind them up, put them in the compost pile, and the next spring they're really good mulch. And of course, you know this, we don't use pesticides ever. Okay, let's go on to the shrubs. This is a high bush cranberry, viburnum, that's in the background here. I'll give you a little bit more information about it in a minute. First of all, we're going to start with the shrubs of eliminating the invasives. In this photo, the yellow is an ash or something in the fall, and this big green glob is a buckthorn. And the problem with buckthorn, if you don't know this already, is it poisons the ground, so nothing can grow under it, but its shade is also so dense. It comes out early in the spring and stays green. If you question what's buckthorn, if you drive along a roadside or a forest preserve or something in November, the only thing with green leaves still on it are the buckthorn. And that keeps everything else from growing. And that, as I mentioned, in Lake County, there's so many buckthorn that it's keeping little oaks from growing. And so we're losing the oaks because of the buckthorn, losing a lot of other things as well. And the other really invasive, whoops, I'm sorry, oh dear. Got to get to my arrows here. The honeysuckle is just so gnarly and so invasive. It'll spread everywhere. If you've ever tried to cut it down, you know it's just got stems going in every which way. And with both of these, they really do need to be herbicided. We're not big on promoting herbicide, but they will come back if you just cut them, and they'll come back with a vengeance. We recommend painting the stumps rather than spraying, and that way it stays just right on the stump itself. There's a number of reasons to plant native shrubs. One is for habitat. They provide structural diversity as well as supporting the species. But there's species of birds like the wood thrush that nest only in dense thickets. And the juncos and the chickadees not only use them for protection from hawks, but they use them as for shelter in the winter. And, you know, they're the ones that are popping around, still around right now. So lots of possibilities. Here are some examples of dense shrubs that you might want to consider. One of the towns in Citizens for Conservation's area is Barrington Hills. And it's a rich community that is zoned 5 acres. And a lot of the people have 3 acres of grass and 2 acres of buckthorn. And so one of our missions is to try to educate them that they'll keep the buckthorn all the way around the edges as screening. But something like this black haw viburnum is just a wonderful screen. It's as dense as the buckthorn, but isn't as damaging to the environment. Things can grow under it. It loses its leaves, its beautiful color in the fall, and it supports lots of wildlife. This is the high bush cranberry that I showed you the berries of at the beginning. I don't know if you have in your area the Viburnum Borer. We've had that here for the last 3 or 4 years, and I didn't recognize it to start with. I saw that something was eating the leaves of my viburnum, and the Morton Arboretum recommended that you clip off the leaves where the borers are chewing. And I did that, but then they would move farther down and I'd clip some more. Ultimately, I lost, I think, 17 viburnum in my yard to the borers. The ones that they haven't eaten for some reason are the maple leaf viburnum and the nannyberry, the lentatum, that for some reason avoided the borers. But there are these other wonderful shrubs that aren't bothered by them. The serviceberry, the amalanthus. We recently had a program with a plant specialist, but also a woman who used to be a Latin teacher, and to ask her about how do you pronounce all of the Latin names. And she looked at this and said, how do you say it? And I said, we say amalanthus, but she said it's amalanthus. You pronounce each of the vowels in the syllable. So I learned something about the pronunciation. But as she said, go by what you're used to rather than what 2,000 years ago, what the Latin pronunciation was. Anyway, and the ninebark is a wonderful plant as well, a nice big shrubby shrub that also has the beautiful flowers on it and the berries in the fall. There are also some shrubs that are tall if you want more of the height, not necessarily the dimensions around. The black chokeberry is a great one. Again, flowers in the spring and for pollen and berries in the fall. The black chokeberry wants some sun. The pagoda dogwood is just great as an understory tree. And I know that's very prevalent in your area. I have some here, but they're kind of about the north edge of their range, this far north. But a beautiful spreading, with beautiful flowers in the spring and berries in the fall. Here's the nannyberry viburnum. Mine doesn't get this big because it's in a little bit of shade, but it's a beautiful shrub. And here's the maple leaf viburnum that stays smaller, has gorgeous, these white flowers in the spring and just a spectacular bright red color in the fall. So if you're looking for a new nice little shrub, I'd recommend that one. And that one can take more shade than the nannyberry does. And then there's the elderberry. It's kind of unkempt, I guess I might say. The branches go in every which way. I don't recommend pruning heavily on native plants. Let them be natives. But this one, sometimes you need to. I have some kind of in front of my shed, sort of as a screen, and some of the branches, reached across the pathway. So I clip those off. That kind of pruning carefully. But that too has lots of the nice flowers in the spring and lots of berries in the fall. Will feed the birds for a long time. You can make jam out of the elderberry berries if the birds don't get them before you do. And continue to do that. And there are some nice small shrubs too that provide both food and pollen for the critters. The hazelnut is lovely. It needs sun, and you might be hard pressed to get the nuts if you want to collect them before the critters do, because the squirrels and everybody else loves those. But wonderful food for them. Here's the sumac, the little one, the Rus aromatica, that is beautiful as sumac are, but it doesn't get anywhere near as the staghorn or the big ones. So if you want a landscape look to it, as well as providing a habitat. Here's the shrubby St. John's wort. There's a little forb as well, but this one gets big enough to be a spot in the landscape. The gray dogwood is great as an understory tree as well. I have them popping up through my wooded area, and I just leave them. They're a nice little bush, have a little flower in the spring and these beautiful berries in the fall that last as long until the birds get them all. And the New Jersey tea is a tinier shrub. It's maximum about maybe 30 inches tall. It's a lovely one for landscaping because it stays put. It's not going to be. It's rarer in natural areas because it doesn't compete real well. So if you want a nice little shrub for a landscape spot, that's a good one to use. And then we want to be sure that these aren't natives, of course, but but I really promote letting natives be natural. We don't need to prune things into bowling balls or little boxes. And I heard somebody recently call them poodles, where the people prune them. Now it's different if you're doing bonsai, but not just to have the shrubs be. I guess people think they look like they're taken care of if they do that, but how much nicer these yews would be if they were allowed to spread like they're supposed to. Okay, moving right along. I call what I call front yard landscaping. Because sometimes when people are getting enthusiastic about planting natives, they'll put maybe prairie plants in their front yard. And if they get, 6 or 8 feet tall, like Joe Pye or Rattlesnake Master or something, neighbors who don't know what they're doing think they look messy. And we don't need to have people objecting to planting native plants. So, and by front yard, I mean, if it's a city yard, a little spot, maybe a 1/4 acre or a 1/2 acre, and there's a typical, street across the front and a little bit of area to plant, there are some plants that can be selected that really do make a difference. But the other issue is using landscape design elements. So the heights of plants make a difference. Here's an example. I wouldn't recommend the Joe Pye in the front yard, but because it's banked here with an edge and a border and smaller plants in front, they are making it work. But also sidewalks and trimming edges. Any of these things help the passerby see that it's a garden, not just a bunch of plants, although we love bunches of plants. So pay attention to some of the design elements, or if you're advising other people on where to get started, start with the design and then choose the plants accordingly. Here are some great landscape plants for the sun that are pretty well behaved. Of all the milkweeds, the butterfly weed is the most well-behaved. It stays a nice little clump about, maybe 25, 30 inches tall max, and then spreads, but it doesn't go wild and it doesn't get tall and lanky like the common milkweed does. So a great landscape plant. I love the wild white indigo. It gets almost shrubby. If you don't know the plant, it maybe gets to be 36 to 40 inches tall, but makes a nice a structure for the garden. The problem is I have deer wandering through my yard, and the deer love the flowers on this. So I just, as soon as the buds come out, I'm out there spraying deer off on it so that the deer won't eat it. But if you don't have deer, or even if you do and you want to take care of it, you can put that in. And of course, there's the purple coneflower. Lots of ecological value because of the seed heads, because of the pollinators love it, and then the seeds, of course, last into the fall. And there's the pale purple coneflower as well that has the big seed heads on it. Rough blazing star, this picture was taken in a prairie, but ordinarily if you're using it as a garden plant, you need to plant several of them sort of close together and maybe some shorter things around them because they'll flop over otherwise. They're tall and stately. They're used to being supported in the prairie. And so we just have a couple of them in your garden. You're going to have to be staking them up or supporting them somehow. And the bee balm is so wonderful for pollinators. They just swarm on it, but it spreads a lot. And so if you have a big space to fill, that's good. But if you want it to stay as a specimen plant, that wouldn't be one of your front yard plants. Here are some other ones that are great landscape plants. The great blue lobelia, which wants to be a little bit moist, if you can. I have it in my rain garden. The obedient plant is, by the way, not obedient. It's disobedient because it spreads. But if you have an area where you want it to spread, like I put it along the roadway where I wasn't really tending it and let it just sort of spread along, and it looks gorgeous in the fall or in the late summer. Of course, the brown-eyed Susans and the black-eyed Susans, both of them are easy to grow and beautiful in the garden. I recommend the royal catchfly, this red one, instead of the red cardinal flower, because the cardinal flower is short-lived. It's hard to tell how long it's going to be. It might last a couple of years and then the next year it's just not there. Some people have more success keeping it going, but the royal catchfly is easy. It's easier to grow. It grows. The cardinal flower doesn't want competition, and this one's fine being surrounded by asters or something else, and it gives the same beautiful red color. If you want red, white, and blue in the summer, you can do the blue lobelia, the royal catchfly, and the Culver's root, blooming all about the same time, and great garden plants. Here are some landscape plants for shade. Again, well behaved. All of these are sort of my favorites. And I have an acre, but most of it's, as I mentioned, the trees. And so I'm always looking for what grows in the shade. I love the red baneberry. I have the white baneberry too, but the red baneberry is so showy. It gets these beautiful clumps of red berries on it, and the flowers are kind of insignificant, but these come about early July and are just a beautiful show. You know the wild columbine. This is the only columbine that's native to Illinois. The big blue columbine is the state flower of Colorado, and it's native there. You know that the bees particularly like any cone-shaped flower, so they'll be up in here getting the pollen. And the columbine is a spring bloomer. You know the Virginia bluebells, I expect. I learned, speaking of the Latin names, I learned an interesting little tidbit. I wondered why so many things were either Virginica or Virginiana or Canadensis. And I read that because so many of these plants were named by Thomas Jefferson in the early part of the country, that if they grew in the South, he called them Virginica. If they grew in the North, he called them Canadensis, even if it's North is Illinois, not Canada. So that's a little reason why they're called that. Apparently the bluebells have this wide range so that they're everywhere. This is completely ephemeral. So it spreads, it puts a beautiful show on in April or early May. And then a month later, it dies completely. So if you don't have it and you're planting it in your yard, plant it along with maybe some ferns or something. The ferns come up later and fill up the space. But if you just plant it by itself, you'll have a bare spot in your yard. And it's hard once it's died back to know where it is to be able to plant something else in with it. So think about a combination for the bluebells. Woodland Phlox is one of my favorite spring woodland plants because it's showy. Some of them are so little, you know, the trout lilies and the little Dutchman's breeches and so forth are spectacular, but they're little and you have to be up close to them to see them. Whereas the woodland phlox spread themselves through a lot of my woodland area, and they just look spectacular in the spring. And of course, the native geranium. Again, there's lots of geraniums in the garden stores, but this is the one native one, and very easy to grow. It spreads nicely, but it just sort of sprinkles itself around, so it's not invasive. It's just not going to stay put in one spot exactly. And there are some well-behaved grasses. You know, we have all the fountain grass and some of the things that people are planting that we try to recommend that they put a native grass in instead. I've seen the Cytotsgrama planted in a corporate front area that was done completely with native plants, and it was just spectacular, just standing in a stand like this. But you can do clumps of it as well. And the big blue stem is way too big for typical front yard landscaping, but the little blue stem is a nice little clump, and it spreads, gets bigger, but it's this gorgeous red. I still haven't learned why it's called blue stem, but it's red stem. But it also had the little white fluffs are all the seeds on them, and so that's really puts on a show. And my favorite grass for gardens is prairie dropseed. It too is kind of conservative in the natural areas in the prairies, but in a yard, it's this beautiful clump. Gets to be about maybe 24 inches tall max, and then it's dropseed because the seed heads drop over and spread around, and the seed eaters like them. Okay, moving along real quickly. Here are some other natives that I say not front yard, because these are the ones, if you have a space that you can have really tall things, maybe is your front yard, but not right by your front door probably. Or if you have a prairie space big enough, you know, sun in your yard, here are some great things. The purple giant hyssop is just a pollinator magnet. everything loves it. All the milkweeds, of course, with the monarchs. And we emphasize the milkweeds for spring for the monarch the caterpillars, but monarchs need pollen the rest of the year as well. So it doesn't just have to be milkweeds for the pollen part of it, but they love them as well. Here's the prairie coreopsis, the rattlesnake master. This looks small, but it isn't. Rattlesnake master, the stalks get to be possibly 5-6 feet tall in full sun. And they do have an interesting flower head on them. It's a nice plant. It's just gets really big. And the purple Joe Pye weed spreads a lot. So there are two of them. One of them is better in the shade, but both of them are tall and pretty aggressive. Okay, we've been talking about the pollinators. Let's take a look at them. This is a showy goldenrod, not the weedy golden, the tall Canadian goldenrod that takes over the roadsides, but a good landscape plant. And you can see the bees on here. So yes, we want to plant milkweeds for the various types of milkweed for monarchs. Any of them work. Some are better in the sun. Most of them are better in the sun. But they need the pods. If you want specifically swallowtail butterflies, plant some meadow rue. That's their favorite. There's of course lots of plants that provide nectar for the summer. Butterflies, bees, everybody. And but you also want plants for the monarchs in the fall that are migrating, so they have some source of food. And the goldenrod is a good one. Asters are another one that bloom well into late September. So there's still something blooming for the monarchs to feed on before they do their long flights back to Mexico. Bumblebees particularly like multiple flower bulbs. If you've ever, this is a rusty patch bumblebee. I didn't take this photo. It was taken in one of Citizens for Conservation's preserves on the Liatris. But if you watch the bees, sometimes they'll bounce from one flower to another in a clump like this. So people have told me, well, they planted a milkweed or they planted a something and wondered why they didn't get the pollinators. And the fact is that the more you put together, the more likely they are to find it. And if there's a bunch of flowers, the more likely they are to hang around and feed on lots of them. So another example, the bergamot is a great one that has lots of a big flower head, and the goldenrods that showy goldenrod that I showed you. And sometimes I have people say, I don't want to plant plants because I don't want to attract bees. I'm allergic to bee stings. And I have to educate them that bumblebees don't sting. If you squeezed one in your hand, you'd get stung, but they're not going to come out at you like the wasps and the yellow jackets do. Honeybees do, but honeybees aren't the natives. The honeybees are the ones that have been imported to pollinate the orchards in California and places. We want the bumblebees, and we want to encourage people not to be afraid of bumblebees. Planting plants like this to get the bumblebees doesn't increase your chances of being stung by them. So we need to make sure people know that. Did you know that ants are the second best pollinators next to bees? And I have to tell you a story about the bloodroot. This is a beautiful spring ephemeral. Well, the leaves last for quite a while, but if you don't know it, it's a wonderful plant. Unfortunately, it blooms early and the flowers only last for maybe a week, and particularly if you get wind or hail or heavy rain or something. But I had some of these in the far back of my property, just a remnant coming back. And then I would find them popping up here and there around the yard. And I kind of wondered, they have a big seed. And I thought, that's not windblown. And then I learned that ants like the pulp around the seed. You master gardeners know this, the iliosome. And so the ants take the seed and eat the iliosome, and then drop the seed wherever they happen to be, because they're not eating the seeds. And so they have spread the bloodroot all around my yard. And I find that they are very easy to transplant. So if they pop up somewhere I don't want them and I want them to be in a showy or a spot, I can dig the plant up. But the ants are helping me spread them. The other pollinators are dragonflies and damselflies. They are, if you have water in your yard of any kind, and it's non-polluted, they are a good indicator of clean water. But they also need plants along the water edge. So don't just have a pond with black plastic, on the base, because first of all, they want to lay their eggs in the mud. But when the larvae come out, the nymphs actually, they need to be able to climb out of the water on stalks, on stems of something. So you need to have some plants along the water's edge. I have blue flag iris in my little stream, and the dragonflies can literally walk up the whole stalk of it until they dry out, and then they can fly away. And of course, I know, we have to educate people that pesticides don't just kill the bad bugs, they kill the pollinators. And they kill the caterpillars that baby birds eat. So we say be happy to have holes chewed in your oak leaves, because that's caterpillars that are going to feed some baby birds. And of course, we're trying to educate people not to buy plants from the garden centers that are advertised as pest-free, because they have a systemic pesticide in them. That's what keeps them pest-free. But they're going to kill the good bugs as well as the bad ones. Now, let's take a quick look at the birds. How are we doing for time? We're through here. We have a lot of good photographers at CFC, but this is one of the bobolinks that were taken in our prairie. It's on its milkweed. Recognize that different bird species prefer different habitats. I don't have bluebirds in my yard because they want a little more open prairie, but it's interesting, and we have them returning to our restored prairies that are like 45 acres or so, but I do have friends who have just a little bit of open prairie in their yard, and they do get the bluebirds, so that's a good option. I have lots of woodpeckers of all kinds. I even have seen some red-headed woodpeckers, which are very rare around here, but I have, the red-bellied and the flickers and the downies and the woodies, because I have so many trees. And so I've even left one dead oak that's not going to fall on the house or anything, so that the woodpeckers have a home. And then especially sedge wrens prefer sedges. So there's specific plants. If you're looking for a particular bird, you look at the different habitats. And we know that thrushes and catbirds prefer the thickets. We also need to pay attention to the various seasonal needs. Migrating birds, of course, need fuel, shelter, both in the spring and fall. We see so many very pristine yards that have turf grass and maybe a shrub or two, and maybe a bird feeder, but the birds need more than just the food. They need twigs, fiber, and insects. And the insects for the babies, but the rest of it for their nests. And ground nesters need thatch and grasses. So if you can, leave some part of your yard without being mowed or neat and trim. I shred most of the branches that are coming down, but in the fall I leave a patch of branches just sort of back behind my shed, so that some things have a place to get shelter in the winter, and to put their nests in there, not their nests, to overwinter. We know that fledglings that fall out of a nest need ground cover under the trees and shrubs, or they will be the victim of some bigger bird that's coming after them, or the hawks or so whatever. And in the summer, of course, hummingbirds need lots of sources of nectar. Your hummingbird feeder is fun because they're right by your window and you can see them, but they really want those plants that are cone-shaped or V-shaped so that they can get their proboscis down inside them. And winter birds need nuts and seed sources, places to stash food, and shelter. Think about that when you're adding more plants to your yard. There are some birds particularly that want the berry bushes. This is another photo. The fellow that took the bobolink took this photo of the cedar waxwing with a berry in its mouth. There's winterberry, service berries that I showed you earlier, the bug shrubs, the black chokeberries, the dogwoods, all of them have nice berries in the spring. So not only are they attractive shrubs, but they're feeding the birds too. The hummingbirds and the Baltimore Orioles want to get into the core of the plant for the nectar. Virgin spower, the nodding wild onions, wild columbine, most of the tube-shaped flowers are good as sources of nectar for these guys. And these different kinds of food are good for the different birds. If you don't have, get all of this on here, there's a list like this in the World Wildlife Foundation has on its website has a listing of what kind of seeds or food to feed for different kinds of birds. So, but a nice variety of them. If you can have those in your yard, it's one thing to have the seeds in a bird feeder, but it's also, why not have the sunflowers right in your yard to feed them? And lastly, don't let your cat outside. Let's look quickly at for season appeal. This is a part of my backyard. This golden tree is the bitternut hickory. The shagbark hickories get a little bit less colorful, but these are just gorgeous. And then these are the black oaks that haven't turned yet. I have white oaks farther over to the side too. But let's look at spring. The shooting stars are a wonderful little plant to have if you don't already. It's not totally ephemeral. I mean, the leaves will stay a while, but it's a fun one to have come up. Jacob's ladder is a great one. It becomes a ground cover, and again, it's easy to grow and fills in. It'll sprinkle itself around, but I let them do that. That's what, I have enough natural areas that I just want them to fill in. I mentioned the Woodland Flocks earlier that does that, and for full sun, the Prairie Smoke is a gorgeous little plant. So many of this, you think of the prairie plants as being big, but this is little and just such a cheery thing to see in the spring. It's called Prairie Smoke if you don't know the plant, because when it goes to seed, it's got a little seed head, a little puffy seed head that looks like smoke, I guess, when you think about how things get named. Here's a bunch more that are the great ones. There's all this bunches of sunflowers of various helianthus kinds of things, great summer plants. I mentioned the liatris earlier. This is one of them. There's several of them that make good summer plants. Here's the eastern swallowtail on its meadow rue. And of course, the monarch on this one happens to be on the milkweed, but again, they're happy to be on any flowering plant with nectar. Do you know the gentian? The prairie gentian is rare and hard to find, and a little bit harder to grow. The bottle gentian is also purple, doesn't open up like this, but still beautiful fall color, late, like September blooming. And the bottle gentian, even though it's not opening up with its nectar showing, the bees get down inside them and bounce around, going after doing their pollinating. Here's the goldenrod. There's this showy goldenrod. It's good for the bees. The woodland sunflowers, again, this one spreads quite by rhizomes, so it's quite aggressive. But I love it in my woods in the fall when nothing else is blooming. It just spreads itself and sort of a golden sprinkled all the way through the woods. And many of the asters are good, but this one is the heath aster. Lots of flowers late into September for the critters that need them. And then winter, of course, you've got this is the pale purple coneflower with its big seed heads. Be sure you leave them standing. There's some value on the ground, but don't clear them away. Don't cut them back. I think you master gardeners know that, and I'm not sure if all of you native gardeners do. But the more you can leave of the plant standing through the winter, the more help they are to the birds particularly. And of course, the white pines have the pine cones. I have a nutty yard because I have the oaks, the hickories, the walnuts. I don't have hazelnuts because I don't have enough sun, but the birds. And last year was, for some reason, a really big bang up year for walnuts. So I still have walnuts coming down and the squirrels are still eating them. And the winterberry is a good berries that last until the birds get them all in the winter. Okay, moving along real quickly. We also need to talk a little bit more about water. I talked about the dragonflies and the damselflies, but there's a number of ways. This is just a little water feature that my mother actually put in her yard. If you have a pond, this is on Honey Lake in North Barrington. We really need to pay attention to the edge and get rid of some of the neighbors over here have this solid is buckthorn. My friend who did this, they planted native plants and have an open space, and she gets the turtles and all the critters coming in. This is my next door neighbor's yard. When I moved in, my stream had cement blocks up on both sides of it, just as ugly as sin. So I tapered both sides and put native plants on it. My neighbor instead put rocks up, but of course, when we had a 7-inch rain, it washed the rocks out of the stream bank and pushed down into the stream. And this is just eroding and eroding. So if you have a stream, pay attention to what you can do. Many of the ones in our area, the banks are filled with reed canary grass, which, yes, it prevents erosion, but it doesn't do any good, and it spreads terribly, and it's really, really hard to get rid of. So it's a major effort to try to change it. And this is the Fragmites giant reed that some people think is pretty, but it is so aggressive. Its roots can spread 20 feet underground, so you can't pull it. It's pretty darn hard to dig. So really, that very often, if there's a big infestation of it, it needs to be, we need professional restoration people to come in to herbicide it with the kind of herbicide that doesn't get into the water table. But we need some water for critters, shelter for those that live in it, food. But to attract water birds and migrating birds. If you are in an area with some should be open water, many of our open areas up here have been choked off with cattails and reed canary and giant reed, and it's a real big challenge to open it up. But we need it to keep the migrating birds to come in. And as I mentioned, the dragonflies need to have plants along the edge. Rain gardens are probably the most common way for people that don't have an actual source of water. If you have a wet spot in your yard where the rainwater runs, that really is an opportunity to turn it into a rain garden. The good plants here, including the sedges, are wonderful for it. This is the marsh marigolds that aren't marigolds at all, but are a beautiful spring plant that grows in the water. I had the marsh marigolds and the blue flag iris planted in my stream, and we had a huge 7-inch rain and a flooded, and it washed them away. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're gone. And what it did was wash them from the bank down, farther down into the water, and they are thriving. They are fine with their feet in the water or near it. Okay, and of course they provide all of the same food value that the other critters need, but they also, by the way, the rain gardens really, in addition to being a good looking alternative for wet grass, help restore the water in the water table. There's quite a process to create a rain garden. There's lots of resources available to do that, but it's worth the effort if you have a spot to do it. So you might just have a bird bath, or in this case, just a source of water for the birds in the winter. I have my stream in the front and my bird bath in the back, so I get both of them covered. And real quickly, just a quick thing about ground covers and mulch. These aren't real low ground covers, but you've got the wild geranium and in here somewhere is the Virginia waterleaf spreading around. That's over here too. Here's some other examples. The best thing to do is to create your own compost. Leaf mulch is the best. I'll talk a little bit later about the ones to buy. Ground covers are the best habitat. If you're expanding, you're eliminating some turf grass and expanding the area around trees is a good way to expand habitat. grind up your leaves, or just leave the whole leaves down there in the winter, not on your grass, but under the trees. And that provides shelter and whatever seeds are supplying in it as well. Here are some good ground covers for shade, the wild ginger. There are sedges that are good. My favorite is a burr sedge with these little mace-like things at the end. It's a little bit taller, but the Carex rosea, curly wood sedge is a good one. Pen sedge is good. They're grown for shade. They're natives of the shade. A Virginia creeper, woodbine. People think it's bad because it climbs up trees. It does not kill trees. It can look pretty going up a tree, but of course it's got this beautiful fall color. And ferns. This one is my favorite, the maidenhair fern, and some of the ferns get taller than they wouldn't be ground covers, but they spread out, this little umbrella shape spreads around. And here's the Virginia waterleaf. These are things that you wouldn't plant if you want them to, well, the ferns don't spread real fast, but the Virginia waterleaf spreads fast. I have it around my shed where I don't want to have to pay attention to gardening, but I also don't want weeds there. And it blooms and looks beautiful and is good for pollinators in the spring. There are some for the sun as well. There's several different sedges. This one stays smaller. The sand phlox, if you have the kind of soil it wants, it's a spectacular showy ground cover in the sun. Or purple lovegrass is another interesting one. Lots of possibilities for ground covers. Please do not buy cedar mulch. They're cutting down cedar trees, big, magnificent cedar trees, just to make mulch. And that's as bad as cutting down old growth forests to make toilet paper. Just isn't necessary. And dyed mulch doesn't add anything to the habitat. The best mulch, as I've been saying, is leaves. But if you're purchasing mulch, see if you can find the coconut coir. It's actually the coconut husks they're ground up, and at least that's natural. And of course, we want to support the critters. If you have water, or in one case, somebody had a turtle laying nests in her garden, her vegetable garden, and she said, "What should I do about it?" Of course, the reptile expert said, "Don't touch them. If you try to move them, you'll kill them. So let it be and let them hatch, and you can plant your garden afterward." If you have water, you want to attract the amphibians, the turtles. The possums and raccoons are going to be whether you want them or not, as well as the deer and rabbits. This is a deer looking at me in my little patch of woods, and they just want to be there. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes when I have something blooming that I absolutely do not want them to eat, I spray deer off on them. Or I have my Trillium grandiflorum that is just candy for the deer, and as soon as they come up, I put little wire cages over them so the deer don't get them. Don't worry about spiders outside. You may not want them inside, but the birds do eat them. And the fireflies, we don't have very many around anymore because we don't have very much leaf litter. If everybody has a neat, tidy yard, we've lost our fireflies. And of course, there are some bad bugs. I'm moving quickly here. But flickers and grackles do eat the Japanese beetle. My landscapers always want to, kill the grubs in my yard, and I say, no, the robins like them. Let them be there. We don't want gypsy moths or Viburnum Borer. There are some things we just absolutely have to kind of put up with, I guess. And just summarize some of what I've been saying. We've got some earth-friendly. We want to reduce the turf grass. Look at this. All of these could be nice native plant areas around the trees and still have some turf grass. The best easy way to do it is to expand habitat under the trees to start with. And as I mentioned, we don't want the volcanoes around the base of them. So we talked about leaving the leaves on the ground in the fall under the trees. Leave snags and brush if you can. Dead stalks. The elderberry is great because it's got a hollow stem and it's used as habitat for anybody that wants to lay eggs in there. Leave the seed heads for the finches and the chickadees. And it's really good to have a messy yard in the winter. Here's my dead snag, and here's my little patch of prairie that's been left for the winter. Really, really don't want to use pesticide. Herbicide very sparingly. There's lots of ways to be able to get rid of things. The exceptions to that are the buckthorn and the honeysuckle, as I mentioned, that you really can't get rid of. You can pull little buckthorn, but if it's a tree, you really do have to herbicide the stump. And remember, native plants don't need or want fertilizer. If you think you're doing them a favor, and all they do is get big and leggy because they aren't used to it. And one other thing, pay attention to the issues about light pollution. Night light helps predators go after the moths or whatever, and it disorients the birds. So if you want lights, use yellow LEDs or motion lights for security. But here's an example of excessive outdoor lighting. Yes, it makes the house look pretty, but it's not good for the environment. So enjoy your habitat year-round. You can make a difference. Everybody joining together can make a habitat corridor. This is my backyard, my deck, and I've got the wild ginger along the edge. I made the mistake of putting in northern sea oats here as a grass, because it's fine in the shade, but it's really aggressive and I'm pulling it out a lot. But there's the black cohosh behind here. There's some blue cohosh down in here. There's the nannyberry viburnum, a little shrub over here. And these are sedges, because grass didn't want to grow in the shade. So just a real quick, there's some other things blooming that bloom in here before the rest of them come up. So a quick overview. So real quickly, these photos were all taken locally by these folks. And my friend Wayne Schild made the fancy movement in the PowerPoint for me. And here are some resources. The citizensforconservation.org website has a native plant database that if you're wondering what conditions a particular plant want, you can look there. There's lots of other resources out there you may know about. We have a native plant sale. Pre-orders are happening now. The sale is always the first weekend in May, so I notice that's a couple weeks earlier than yours. We have a program called Habitat Corridors, which is where native plant experts go to individuals' homes to help them either get started by identifying the invasives that are there or whatever, but also even with people that are more along, sometimes they have a particularly problem area or they have a question about what will grow here. That's the kind of thing that our Habitat Corridors people can do. And then we have this program on the Citizens for Conservation website, but it's also going to be recorded on the Wild Ones website, I understand. And you know about Douglas Talames. This is only one of his books, but I mention him because if you want to know which plant hosts which pollinators or insects, there's a great index in Bringing Nature Home that tells you that. And I mentioned the National Wildlife Federation that has which plants support which insects as well. So one other resource I'd like to refer you to is the ChicagoLivingCorridors.org. It's an organization, it's an umbrella organization founded a few years ago in the Chicago area to coordinate and make a map of all of the organizations that are helping homeowners expand the habitat on their yard, including two of the Wildwoods chapters in our area, the West Cook Wildwoods and the North Cook. I got them right. West Cook and Kane County Wild Ones. Anyway, and they have these particular programs that were recorded during the pandemic, but there's many more of them on there. So if you're just looking for more resources, it's a good one to have. So that, if I can do out of here, there you go.
Thank you so much, Peggy. We do have some questions here. I will start with Catherine. She is wondering, what is the best way to get rid of Tree of Heaven?
That's another one like the buckthorn that you cut it at the ground level and then herbicide the stump. And you probably will have little ones coming up around, so just keep after them. You might have to do it for a couple of years because they'll keep coming up from shoots.
Yeah, a few people.
And by the way, don't keep the wood. Don't let it stand in your yard. The same thing is true with the buckthorn. You want to bag it up, bag the branches up, and put them, get them taken away, or if you can burn. I don't know how, if your area, whether you need to be able to burn things.
That's good.
I helped a neighbor identify a whole bunch of buckthorn in her yard, and they were going to cut it up and use it as mulch. And I said, no, it's going to poison the soil and get rid of it.
That's good to know. Paul mentioned that they use garland as a way. I think that's a specific brand.
Yeah, it's the one that restoration people use garland. Most stores carry Roundup, and I hate it, but it does work on the Roundup for shrubbery works to kill buckthorn, so that is readily available. If you can get the garland, that's good too. But don't spray. Try to paint it instead.
That's good to know. Jan Carter Seymour just mentioned that she has a website called gogreencrystallake.org, which talks about how to get rid of invasive buckthorn, which is great, Jan. Thanks for providing that for us.
And there's another resource on the citizensforconservation.org website under community education resources. There are some flyers on a lot of different invasives, and you can download them and take them. The front side shows what the invasive looks like, and the back and the second page shows how to go about eliminating them.
That's really good to know. One of the hardest things is to, how can you really identify whether or not what the plant you're looking at is an invasive or not, which those are great resources.
Now, the issue with the buckthorn is the gray dogwood. When they're both young plants, they look similar. When the leaves come out, if you study them, you can tell the difference. And of course, when the buckthorn gets big, it's gnarly and black, and it's pretty obvious. But as a young plant, you want to be careful you're not cutting down gray dogwood instead.
Yeah. Amy was curious to know, what is the Latin name for meadow rue?
Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to look that up.
Okay. I think, someone in chat actually, Thalictrum. I do not know how to pronounce a Latin. I never took a Latin class in my life, so I probably did not say that correctly. Catherine is interested to know if do you happen to know why swallowtails are attracted to meadow rue? What is it about the plant?
In many cases, it's because they've evolved together. That's why the native plants are so much more important than a cultivar. The cultivars might have some nectar for them, but when they have evolved together, that's the one that they'll continue to look for. We recently had a program at Chicago Living Quarters on the carrot family, and it's interesting how the Queen Anne's lace that's pretty weedy is not a native, but the very same critters that like the carrots in your garden.
And Catherine just verified for the audience in chat that male bees do not sting, along with our small native bees. They do not sting either.
What was that?
The male bees of any species does not sting.
Okay.
But then many of the smaller native bees also do not sting. So
exactly. Yep.
Yeah,
the I'm going to show you is the bumblebees, but yes, we've got lots of them that are still doing the pollinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just some clarification for our audience that ants help propagate plants via seeds, not necessarily the pollen, which Peggy highlighted, and it also to not all seeds as well. And most dragonflies and damselflies actually don't pollinate plants, but they are predators to many of the insects, some good and some bad. So that's just some clarification for our audience.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, let's see. Kathy is interested to know, how do you keep weeds from growing among your stepping stones?
How do you keep weeds from growing?
Weeds from growing among your stepping stones?
Well, you could put a low growing sedge in there, and you can walk on it, and it'll definitely keep the weeds from growing if it gets established in there. You could also put mulch between them if you don't want to have the little plants in there. There's also an interesting little native sedum called Sedum tornatum that grows a couple inches tall and has little white flowers on it, but it'll spread, as sedums do, around the stones of your stepping stone as well. Not too many little tiny plants that you'd want to step on, but those would work.
Thank you. Erin is wondering, do you know what Idot is doing to get rid of Fragmites in the ditches?
The IDNR, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, is working at educating IDOT in some ways about right-of-ways, for example. And the one I know about specifically is a teasel. They finally convinced them not to cut the teasel, usually, because that's usually growing along the roadside or ditches or railroad tracks. And when you cut teasel and drop it, the seeds just spread even farther. And so they finally got them to recognize that if they're going to cut it, they have to take the seed heads away. I'm not sure what they're doing with the Phragmites, because that's in wetland, and that's such a challenge to get rid of. But IDNR is pretty much on top of, they're paying attention now how much they can educate the Department of Transportation people. But you do see some areas where it says native plants do not mow. So, there's a little bit getting through.
Yeah, that's always good to see. Jane is just wondering if you do Zoom presentations for garden clubs. Can she contact you directly?
Yes, I do. I've done some, actually, because of the pandemic, we started doing them on Zoom. And so more people are seeing them because you don't have to be nearby to go to a local meeting, Because in some cases, the garden, I like working with the garden clubs because they know plants, but they don't necessarily know the natives. And so I try to introduce them to them.
Yeah. So Jane, go ahead and you can contact Peggy directly to set that up. Elvira is wanting to know if you use pine needles for mulch, and do you plant anything under your pine trees? Do you know of any plant that will grow under pine trees?
Well, I have to tell you a story. I didn't have any, I have some non-native spruce and fir trees that previous owners had planted, but I didn't have any pines. And of course, the white pine is a native, and I wanted one, and I planted one, and it lasted a couple of years and died. And I took the dead needles over to the nursery and said, do you know what's going on? And they said, no, it doesn't look like it's got a pine borer on it. But it died. And so I planted another one, and it died. And that was before I started taking horticulture classes at Morton Arboretum. And I learned about allelopathy and learned that I was planting it under walnut trees, and the walnuts were killing the pine trees. And they are, in fact, sort of the number one issue. Don't plant pine trees under walnuts. So I don't have any pine needles, but absolutely, that's a great mulch. If you have some, do use it. My son has a mountain house at Tahoe, California, and he didn't have any grass. He had all big Jeffrey pines and lodgepole pines, and he had the whole yard was mulched with pine needles. And because of the danger of the fires, he's had to rake up truckloads of pine needles and take them away. Luckily, we don't have that issue here, but I guess the issue is how dense. The white pines usually limb themselves up so that there's some airiness under them, and you can plant a lot of the shade things like the Virginia waterleaf or ginger. Those would grow under a pine.
Great. It can be.
Not the spruces, because the spruces, like the Colorado spruce, are not native here. They're pretty trees, but they tend to be denser and closer to the ground than the pines do.
Yeah. I know that it can be hard to find something to grow under pine trees. So thanks for those suggestions. Pat, your question about the plant sale, it's on the slide that is on the screen right now, citizensforconservation.org. And that website will have more information about the plant sale. Pre-orders are going on now, and the sale itself is happening the first weekend of May. And
unfortunately, we don't ship our plants, so we'd love to have you order them, but it would mean getting somebody to come pick them up here.
That's good to know. Thank you. We appreciate that. So yes, Jane, you can go ahead and contact Peggy via email. Is that a good way to contact you?
Yeah, do you have that? It's just simonson.peggy@gmail.com. Actually, it's better at Citizens. So peggy.simonsen@citizensforconservation.org. And Simonsen is Simonsen.
Okay, I put that in chat. I believe I spelled it correctly. Oh, great. Kathy Montgomery also added it to chat. So thank you. Thank you for that. I think I put the wrong one in. So everyone use the email addresses that Kathy Montgomery added. Okay, we no longer, that looks like all of our questions for this evening. So Peggy, thank you so much for this presentation. I know I personally appreciated the recommendations for the shorter plants that work really well in more of an urban city yard. So really appreciate that information. And for all of you, the recording will be a link will be sent out to everyone later this week. So watch your email for that. And again, as a reminder, our February program that got canceled is rescheduled for April. If you've already registered for that, you do not need to register again. More information and reminders will be sent out about that program as well. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. And thank you so much, Peggy, for sharing your knowledge with us.
You're welcome.